Well, welcome to Baden Hill one more time. And we've been climbing up that hill and climbing up that hill. And finally, we're going to talk about the communist revolution in Russia. This whole process has been so complicated, and you see that revolution doesn't happen overnight in many places around the world. Right now, as I make this video, Venezuela is undergoing a transformation, and still at this time the dictator of that country has power. Even though inflation is skyrocketing and people's lives are getting worse and there are more and more protests, he hangs on to power. And so this is the story of revolutions. They often take a long time. This video is about the communist revolution, and as we said, there were two revolutions predicted by Lenin. Maybe he was performing a self-fulfilling prophecy because he was at the center of both of the revolutions that took place. The first one in February/March of 1917, and the second one would come in October/November of 1917. So, after we'll call it the February Revolution, we would imagine that things would be so much better. But unfortunately, just like the revolution of 1905, there were still many, many problems. The most important problem was that Russia was still in the war. And even though there was a new government called the Provisional Government, it was sharing power with the Petrograd Soviet, or we'll just say the Soviets in general, because there were many councils of workers that propped up, and they organized in a Congress of Soviets, and eventually there was this dual government. And even within the revolutionaries, you had divisions developing. And all the way back to 1903, you had two main groups. Lenin was at the head of the majority group, and they were called the Bolsheviks. And that was back in 1903. The minority group was the Mensheviks, and that's what Mensheviks means. It means minority, and Bolsheviks means majority. The thing is, over time, those groups kind of flip-flopped back and forth as to who was in the majority and who was in the minority, but Lenin was such a powerful figure. And we will see that his ideology, his beliefs, basically won the day. So, what was this February Revolution and this provisional government? Well, know that it had to do with all of those intellectuals and the diplomats who had supported reforms, the nobility, the middle class revolutionaries were largely in control of that provisional government because they had the experience, they had the education, they knew how government worked. And so, in many ways, they were continuing some of the same hierarchies that had caused such problems in the past for Russia. And because of the extreme upheaval in the country, it was difficult for the provisional government to provide basic support for the people, basic services, food. They had a hard time getting industry going. And remember, the war was hanging over everybody's heads. The provisional government decided that they would continue the war as a way to defend the revolution, because if they didn't support the war, they tried to just kind of get out of the war. Eventually they might be attacked by Germany anyway, and the revolution would be over. So there was some logic there in staying in the war to defend against the capitalists, defend against the imperialists and the ones who would take over Russia again. Now, the provisional government is generally socialist in character, and socialism and communism are not the same. So the provisional government was the middle class, and we have another name for that. We say the bourgeoisie, right? So bourgeois is often seen as negative, even though it is talking about the middle class that honestly we tend to champion in the United States and Europe. We tend to see the middle class as representing a country, and the middle class should continue to develop the economy and should be a part of supporting the lower classes as well. And we want more and more people to move into the middle class. But in Russia, the bourgeois was a dirty word, and it had been for the French Revolution as well. So there's a long history of that. So socialism maintains capitalist ideas, but some things are government controlled. Again, things like healthcare, maybe even railroads and banks, things that could cause chaos if they get out of hand. And so the socialist government would control them so that people's lives could be better, and so that people wouldn't fall so low in society that they wouldn't have food, and they would have struggles. So communism is different because it means that the government is completely controlling everything in the country, that there is no private ownership, no private money making. So you can see that even today, when we talk about a communist country, many communist countries are really partly capitalist as well. And so there are very, very few pure communist countries. So it's a complicated situation as we are moving forward in 1917. And you can tell that if things aren't getting better for the common people, then there's going to be more trouble. So we've talked about Bolsheviks and Mensheviks within the revolutionaries, and we talked about the provisional government and the Soviets. So let's say just a little bit more. The provisional government was essentially replacing the Duma from before, and the prime minister was someone who would be the executive, the one in charge, but it was a democracy. Essentially, the idea was to do away with the Duma because it was only a symbol and it was not very democratic. And so there would be a new constituent assembly that would be the people directly electing their leaders. And, that was exciting. It was democratic. So Russia, from February, March forward, was moving toward democracy and giving people more of a say in their government. But the first prime minister was named Prince Georgy Lvov, and things weren't going well for him. And obviously, if he's a prince, he would be seen as a part of this nobility, the bourgeoisie, and even the royalty that had caused all these problems in the first place. And so eventually a period came where the Soviets wanted to take power, and they didn't want to support the provisional government anymore. And these Soviets, remember, it's the workers themselves, and more it included soldiers, sailors, and so even the military stopped obeying the provisional government. And this is a crisis. You know that when the military turns and tries to overthrow the leaders, that's called a coup d'etat, right? So in July, there was a crisis called the July Days, and there were, again, hundreds of thousands of workers converging on Petrograd to protest. First 100,000 and then 500,000, so even more than in the February-March Revolution. And it was more violent, and they were angrier than they had been before. A new prime minister took charge, and his name was Alexander Kerensky. And so Kerensky is in charge of the provisional government as prime minister, It's still a democracy, but things are not looking good for those who are trying to have gradual change in the country. And the ones who want dramatic, violent change, the Bolsheviks, they are starting to get more and more power within the Soviets, and eventually they would overtake the provisional government. So the July days were this period of unrest in Petrograd. And so you have the prime minister, Kerensky, and you have all these workers protesting in Petrograd, and he sent his general. He had just named his general the commander-in-chief of his armies, and that was General Kornilov. And Kornilov was very respected, and he had the faith of all the soldiers, and so that was a good development. But then Kerensky saw that these protests couldn't keep going. It was threatening law and order, and so at first he sent Kornilov to Petrograd, and he said, "Okay, go and put down the protests. Go and attack, if necessary, these rebels, these revolutionaries." Again, it's so strange. It's a revolution against the revolution, right? Well, Kerensky sent Kornilov to Petrograd, but then he changed his mind and he said, no, wait, come back. Because he realized, okay, you may lose the backing of everybody. You may have everybody against you if you send the army to attack protesters. And that was the crisis, because Kornilov said, no, I'm not going to listen to your second order. I'm going to listen to your first order. And so Kornilov went to Petrograd, and meanwhile Kerensky is very panicked. He realizes that everything could descend into chaos, and so he gets a message to get help from the Petrograd Soviet. And so basically he's trying to work together with the more radical revolutionaries, and those Soviet members, the Soviet in Petrograd, actually does kind of get together. And when Kornilov arrives with all of the soldiers, those people in the Petrograd Soviets, they're able to talk to Kornilov and basically diffuse the situation so that no one was killed or hurt. And Kornilov had lost soldiers along the way, so he was ready, to not have to fight them. But afterwards, Kornilov was put in prison because he had mutinied. He had gone against Kerensky's orders, and that made the army angry. Because remember, the army would follow Kornilov and they respected him. And when Kerensky was meddling by putting Kornilov in prison, that created a huge crisis that would not be resolved until the October Revolution. All of this was called the Kornilov Affair. And again, we're giving a name to something, an affair, that honestly it is a huge crisis, and the word affair seems to downplay the significance of it. So let's remember, this was a huge turning point. Let's talk now about Lenin again. Lenin has been a leader. He's been a leader back to 1895. He was a leader at the time of just after his brother had tried to assassinate Alexander III. So he's been in this game for a long time. But he hasn't been the leader of the country, and that is going to change. So what does Lenin do? First of all, from the 1900s on, he is constantly agitating. He's not just a rabble-rouser that tries to get people riled up by speaking to them and shouting at them. He actually promotes violence and assassinations, and again, he is caught up in violence and arrests and exiles. And I guess usually the leaders exiled him because they knew if they killed him that there would be a huge revolution because of how people followed him. So the Bolsheviks under Lenin were bold, and they just kept getting bolder and, again, promoting violence. After the February Revolution, Lenin did not stop with his push to do more than just gradually change from capitalism everywhere to socialism. He wanted communism, and he wanted it now. And he believed that it would be a small group of revolutionaries called the Vanguard, and they would represent the proletariat. The proletariat is all of the working common people. And so he believed that there had to be a violent revolution where those working people would all rise up, and they would get rid of all the leaders, and they would take over everything, and that would be a perfect world, communism. So he was sent into exile even after the February Revolution, and he had to go. Remember, he's been in exile in Siberia, in Sweden, and he ended up in Finland this time. Just a side note, one of the things that happened as a result of the revolution, he was in Switzerland. He was in exile in Switzerland, and the Germans wanted to mess with the Russians, and they wanted to mess with the Tsar. And so they allowed Lenin to be taken by train in a locked, closed train that couldn't be opened so that Lenin could mess around in Germany. And it was allowed to cross over into Russia. And so that's how Lenin got back into Russia at the time of the abdication or the overthrow of the Tsar. But once he was in Russia, he was still, we would say, persona non grata. He was not very welcome, according to people like Kerensky or the other people involved in the government. So this time, between February and October, he was sent. He had to go into exile in Finland, and still he was able to send messages, and he was able to agitate from abroad. He was able to continue promoting this idea. And there were three things: bread, land, peace. Bread, land, peace. Bread, land, peace. He kept at it, and the people realized that, okay, they didn't have bread, they didn't have land yet, although the government was trying to give them the hope of having land, and they didn't have peace because the provisional government, even after the February Revolution, was still in the war. So that became the key issue. And finally, he was able to return, and that would result in the October Bolshevik Revolution. Many times when we talk about the Russian Revolution in October, it's referred to as Red October. There was actually a famous movie about a Russian submarine during the Cold War, much later, that was named Red October in honor of this revolution. We call it the Bolshevik Revolution because it was a part of the ideas of Lenin and the majority of the revolutionaries who wanted a violent overthrow of capitalism. But it should also be known that the October Revolution is called a bloodless revolution. I would disagree with that, but I'll allow you to make your own decision based on what I have to say. Here's how it all went down. We're going to use the old style calendar, so please bear with me, and you can add 13 days to get to the present dates. But on October 24th, soldiers who were loyal to Kerensky and the provisional government started marching on a newspaper office. And it was a Bolshevik newspaper. And so basically their idea was, we want to stop these radical revolutionaries from publishing and inflaming the situation. On October 25th, then, what ended up happening was the Bolshevik soldiers and workers they were organized enough that they attacked. They retook the newspaper office, and they also started taking over government buildings. And specifically, they were going to target the Winter Palace, and that happened the next day. On October 26th, the Winter Palace was under siege. The Winter Palace was in Petrograd, and it was where the government had its offices. It'd be like storming the White House. And finally, the soldiers and the workers were able to force them to surrender, and they cut the cables for the telegraphs so that the provisional government couldn't telegraph armies to come and support them against this second revolution. And so very quickly, it was all over. And, there had, at the same time, there were ships that arrived in Petrograd that were loyal to the Bolsheviks, not loyal to the provisional government. So it was a weak government, and the Bolsheviks then were able to establish their own dictatorship of the proletariat. A dictatorship of workers is what it amounted to. So the Duma, of course, had been disbanded, but now it was officially disbanded, and the constituent assembly would be elected. But really, democracy is not a goal of the Bolsheviks. This Petrograd uprising was very quick, and it really amounts to a political coup d'etat. It amounts to getting the support of the military to overthrow your democratically elected leaders. And so, the rest of the world is very alarmed about this, because the country, even though it was very socialist, it was moving toward democratic representation, and people in the West believed in democracy. And so, the storming of the Winter Palace was the end of the revolution, but it was only the beginning of all of the unrest that would soon come. So this is not the end, even though it seems like the Bolsheviks are completely in power. Because honestly, Nicholas II and his family are still alive. And as long as the royal family in any country is still alive after a revolution, there will be people who still support that royal family, or maybe it's the previous leaders, even dictators, and they will want the good old days. They will want to restore those leaders at some point when they get enough strength. And that often leads to civil war. And because the Bolsheviks were fearing civil war, they executed the entire Romanov family in July of 1918. And you do need to know that has been confirmed. I mentioned this in a previous video, that they found the Romanov family and the remains of those executed members. So violence is at the heart of this revolution. Even though we talk about a bloodless revolution, there was a lot of blood that would be spilled very soon. So this was the October/November Revolution. We'll call it the Communist Revolution. In Lenin's mind, it would take two revolutions: the Socialist Revolution to get rid of that leader on top and establish a bourgeoisie, a middle-class revolution, and then the working-class revolution would be the second revolution to take over. There was a reporter, an American reporter in the country, in St. Petersburg or Petrograd at that time. His name was John Reed. And John Reed wrote a book called 10 Days That Shook the World. Now, he was very sympathetic to the Bolsheviks' cause. He believed that this was a wonderful thing when a country could be turned upside down and a better society created as a result, even if people died along the way. So one thing that immediately happened was Lenin fulfilled his promise. He got out of World War I. So Lenin now is the dictator. He is the leader of this Bolshevik government, and he signs a treaty with Germany called the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. And this basically said, okay, we'll stay out of your backyard, you stay out of our backyard. And this is something that the majority of people wanted. They did not want to be fighting in World War I, and as a result, Russia bowed out of World War I and was not a part of the Allies anymore. Next, Lenin had to govern, and so two things were important to him. First of all, he believed in industrialization, and so he nationalized the industries, the factories, and railroads and things connected to making industry happen. You know, industry is what we call when you mine the metals and then you make them into steel, and then you make the steel into products, and then you use the products or you sell them to other countries. Industry is what marks a modern nation in most people's minds. And so he nationalized industry, and he then, number two, he redistributed the land. Remember, there were landowners that owned incredible amounts of land, and the workers, they were serfs, and then they were freed in 1861, but they continued to work as just very, very poorly paid peasants. And so the land was redistributed, and communes were created where there was a grouping together of farms, and the peasants could work together and they could have a share of what the big farm produced. So land redistribution, it means that peasants get the land, but they also work together to help the country. Now, one other thing that Lenin did is he changed the police force. Now, the police force, I told you, was kind of a secret police. They were like spies, and they were always trying to capture the revolutionaries and put them in prison. And so the Tsar had a secret police force, and now Lenin basically has a secret police force as well. He calls this force the Cheka. And the Cheka were the secret police, and he used the Cheka to control the population. Now, I'm assuming that you have read Animal Farm, and you know that the leader of that story, the main one who controls things after the revolution, his name is Napoleon, but he has a police force, and they are the puppies that he raises, the dogs, and he will use the dogs against his political enemies, and that's precisely what was happening. So on one hand, Lenin is keeping control by using the Cheka, and the common people, they felt very betrayed that these Cheka were being used against them. It was no different from the Tsar. The second thing that Lenin did was he used Pravda, a newspaper, as an instrument to spread news of the revolution all over the world. And so Pravda is a Russian word for truth. And it's ironic because Pravda was basically a propaganda engine, and it was lies for the most part. They only said good things about the revolution, never talked about bad things, and always said bad things about the counter-revolutionaries, the imperialists, the bourgeoisie, the people who were their enemies. So the newspaper was not reporting facts, it was reporting what Lenin and the Bolshevik Party of the communists wanted it to report. Now, the other organization that was created a little bit later, but it's a part of this, is called Comintern. Comintern was the Communist International. It was an organization starting in the Soviet Union, essentially, that had a goal to spread communism throughout the world. And so you'll hear Comintern, Comintern, Comintern used over the history of the 20th century because it was how communism was spreading. And you'll hear that a member or a representative of Comintern would go to other countries and work with those communist leaders to try to have revolution in new countries like China. So this is the reality. Even though there had been this revolution, you have the cycle of violence repeating, and workers do have more say in what's going on, but many people are caught in the crossfire. This was not a bloodless revolution. So here's how it all went down.